and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by The Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am talking to you from New York City. My window actually overlooks like the roof of Grand Central Station, which is interesting how tall I live. I grew up here. Didn't realize how tall Grand Central Station was. But that's neither here nor there. Today we're doing something a little special. We have a very special guest, but we also have a very special guest host insofar as both the Remnant, the flagship podcast of the Dispatch, and the Dispatch podcast both wanted this guest, and we both booked him, but we realized it in time and did not want a repeat of the John Ward fiasco. So what we decided to do was actually do a co-hosted thing. It'll show up in both feeds, and I believe, and I got this guy from deep in the editorial bowels of the Dispatch. He goes by the name Steve Hayes. So he's joining us. And our guest is none other than Ben Smith, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of Semafor. He was also the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News from 2011 to 2020, and a media columnist at the New York Times from 2020 to 2022. His most recent book is Traffic: Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion in the Billion-Dollar Race to Go Viral. Ben Smith, welcome to The Remnant.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for that glimpse at internal Dispatch politics. Brutal.
Where I am nothing if not transparent to my my listeners, unlike Steve, who wants to keep everything behind a psychological paywall of sorts. Steve, hello, welcome.
That's false.
You can speak. Yeah,
that's false.
There you go.
Hello.
All right, so Steve can jump in whenever he wants, but I'll start with my time-honored first question for all authors on this podcast. This is the question I like to get the most when I'm on a book tour. What's your book about?
Well, thank you guys for having me, first of all. And the book is about this era we all just lived through in media. I mean, and technology, starting, I suppose, in the early 2000s, and going through this massive explosion of social media that, I think kind of like crashed through everybody's life and through politics, as well as certainly through the news business. And ending, when I started writing the book in 2000, it sort of felt like this moment was coming to an end, and I was sort of interested in going back to this kind of downtown Manhattan scene in the early aughts, where, to my mind, it started. It does feel, the book published a week ago, and it just sort of weird, slightly depressing timing. BuzzFeed News, Vice, both in huge trouble, right? And BuzzFeed News shut down. Vice is, I think, headed for bankruptcy. And it does feel like a kind of punctuation mark on that particular era of media.
I was kind of thinking that maybe you had arranged the timing of this because it's so perfectly on brand for it's like writing a book about the next pope when the pope dies, like writing a book about this weird aspect of American media right as some of the most iconic brands in the media are just going out the window. I know it's grim because you have friends there and these are people with real jobs and all of that, but at the same time, it's sort of fortuitous for the conversation.
Yeah, my colleague Katie Notopoulos, who has a particularly dark sense of humor and is at BuzzFeed, like the second she got the bad news about BuzzFeed News, tweeted that my book stunts had gone too far.
So as a follow-up to what's your book about, so what is your basic takeaway for, like, what is the theme to the pudding? Like, why did the last 20 years look the way they did? And sort of what are the lessons you think we have going forward that are constructive for it? Not like how we can get more kitten videos to go viral, but like what do you think are the major lessons of the last 20 years of sort of media expansion and collapse and expansion and collapse?
Well, I think, I actually am still, like you, trying to do a new thing and trying to figure out the lessons. I do feel like I see more clearly what happened, which was that there was this, this moment in the early aughts, not totally unlike this one in the sense that people were fairly alienated from the media in various ways, partly because the sort of establishment media was totally out of touch with the way we were all actually getting news on the internet, and partly because of the Iraq War, I think, and the way in which, like the big establishment places had, in the eyes of a lot of their audience, screwed it up. And so there was this sort of flowering of, blogs that you guys remember and weird websites that weren't like BuzzFeed, that weren't really journalism at all. A more partisan progressive media like Huffington Post. And this was all like relatively small scale, and then but was sort of ready for the moment when social media came along, and BuzzFeed in particular just, got incredibly massive on the back of Facebook, and these other platforms, but made a huge bet that they would become to Facebook what like MTV was to cable. That was the core idea, and raised an enormous amount of venture capital, $400 million for BuzzFeed, more for Vice, on the backs of that theory. And, that theory, and you can sort of look back and say, wow, that was totally delusional, or say, it just didn't break that way. But in either case, but it just absolutely didn't work out. And I think, but it had, I think, sort of that way of thinking about doing media, certainly both, for the relatively boring story of like the news business, but also I really think for the story of national politics had a lot of ramifications.
Well, it turns out the news business side of the story is far more interesting, I think, than I would have imagined when we were living through it, and certainly as it comes through in your book, really at the heart of the story. I mean, one of the things that struck me as I was reading the book, sort of throughout the book, and you walk readers through sort of the growth of this attention economy, the two different approaches with Jonah Peretti and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post and Nick Denton at Gawker, and sort of very clear that attention is the coin of the realm, that's what everybody is looking for, even if they're seeking to capitalize on it in slightly different ways. It seems to me that there were not many moments as people were looking at this attention economy where sort of journalists, or maybe scolds, if we want to regard them as such, stopped and said, hey, is this focus on attention coming at the expense of truth? Were there those kinds of discussions? I mean, you talk about when you joined BuzzFeed to run BuzzFeed News, and you had some of those moments, it sounds like. But was that just foreign to the broader discussion of how we were providing people information as this attention economy grew?
I mean, I don't think that, the traffic, which was really the sort of the measure of attention, right, created the phenomenon of journalists trying to pander to their audience. I mean, I think, as old, like making stuff up because you think your audience will like it is like the first move in successful American media in like the 1830s with the rise of the New York Sun, the moon hoax, which was their big hit about people on the moon. But I do think that it's as though, and this is, across the board, we were sort of operating without instruments. We were like flying our little biplane by eye, and suddenly in these traffic dashboards and this totally direct connection to the audience, we had instruments that we could measure with sort of exquisite detail what people actually wanted to hear, and what they had no interest in, and we'd been telling ourselves that actually they wanted to hear because it had some civic value. And I do think that certainly put more pressure and clearer pressure on everyone to pander to an audience, or in the worst side, on the best side, to do work to answer questions they were interested in. But it did require, doing good journalism sort of in some ways required in a more explicit way saying, hey, we're not going to say that even though it's not true. And there were, I think, clear advantages, and you can see them, to the people who just said, we're going to, either it just totally make things up, because they're what people want to hear in the case of certain kind of like bottom of the internet entrepreneurs. But also sort of stream on a kind of politics that's about tightening the social media feedback loop with your followers.
Well, let me dive a little deeper on that question itself. There's a passage when you're having these conversations with Jonah Peretti and others about the possibility of you joining BuzzFeed as editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News. And they sort of approached you. You were kind of dismissive, weren't sure you wanted to do it. You went home and talked to your wife. She saw the possibilities, I guess, in a way that you didn't. And so you wrote this memo, sort of went back to them saying, hey, maybe this could work. And I want to just read a quick chunk from your book. As you're sort of pitching yourself, you said, I was good at getting myself into the middle of a spirited online space. I wrote a profile of a Washington Post blogger who was trying to kill Rick Perry. That in turn prompted an attack on her from a prominent right-wing blogger, which prompted the Post writer to call him an anti-Semite, all playing out on our site. All fun and games, it seemed to me at the time. I mean, that to me, that passage sort of encapsulates the problem, right? I mean, you got all the attention, you got traffic, people came, they paid attention to it. Was there really any value to come out of those exchanges? It feels to me, in the way you describe it, as like, professional wrestling of journalism. And it sounds like in that last line, you basically saying that it sounded like fun and games at the time, that you've come to think that wasn't the greatest idea.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And yes, and as you read that passage, I sure do sound awful. I think right. We felt like there was this, and I think I was at Politico where this was, something we did prior to do. To sort of like that there was these sort of what had moved from being this very wooden newspaper conversation about politics. This is very human, feisty one that we were all kind of addicted to as political junkies, and seemed in some sense more honest, I think, than what we'd been doing before. Like it reflected the actual sorts of things journalists say to each other rather than the sort of formalities of sort of official capital J journalism. But it also, and I think you really see it there, and you definitely saw it in social media, has this kind of flattening effect where every story is the same size and everything that happens is the same level of interest, which I think I sort of felt then, but didn't really think hard about. And I think you really saw on social media. Right. And there was this new generation of media. And again, I think the real winners of this would be Twitter and Facebook that captured this conversation. Like this ultimately didn't play out on BuzzFeed. It played out on Twitter in the sort of long run of that kind of politics.
Not to break up the narrative here, but I do have just a basic question, and between the two of you, maybe someone will have an answer for me, which is that, so like in internet years, I'm Methuselah, right? I was the founder of National Review Online in like 98, 99, something like that. And there have been times where, and maybe it was because I was always listening to my dad when he was still alive, who was a longtime newspaper syndicate guy, where there were just things that seemed like obvious bad ideas, but they were bad ideas that needed time to prove they were bad ideas. And in the short term, if you didn't follow them, you lost, right? It's sort of like, one example is the pivot to video. I thought the pivot to video was stupid from day one, really resource intensive. I never met anybody who loved autoplay videos. And yet there was this massive lemming-like rush everywhere. And a bunch of actual good reporters and journalists have lost their jobs because of this idea of pivoting to video, which now I think everybody sort of considers a joke. But for all I know, in another 20 years, it will just have been a premature good idea. And you can see it, there are a whole bunch of places where it seems, and I hate the phrase inflection point, but there were a whole bunch of moments where it seems like the media collectively got caught up in an idea of what was a good business practice. And it took years of evidence for them to realize it wasn't. And, this started with the newspapers who basically just handed away classified ads, which were the bread and butter of their business model for over a century, to the internet without doing anything to keep hold of all that. And so I guess the question is, and so now, just one last example, and now it's dawning on everybody, hey, giving away our product forever for free is not a great business model necessarily. And this is why you're seeing the rise of paywalls everywhere and much, much more robust subscriber models, which were, again, the model for a century. And it took the internet 20 years to figure out that maybe that was the right model all along. So I guess the question is, did it always end up did it have to be this way? Or were there moments along the way since like 96, 98, where if you could go back in time and just explain to people, don't do this, take this fork in the road, not that fork in the road, that we would still see a lot more local news, that we would still see more thriving 2 newspaper towns, which is the really essential thing to keep the industry going, is you need 2 newspapers in every town, not just 1 newspaper in every town. Or was this just all inevitable and these mistakes were going to be made, and the creative destruction of internet is the creative destruction of the internet, and it was going to happen no matter what?
I mean, I know this is a terrible answer, but yes. But I just think you step back, the destruction, the changes to our society of digital tech and media are so profound, and advertising really was going to shift to these things. And I don't think the notion that newspaper companies were going to be the people who drove the innovation in the ad industry really makes sense. That said, there are places, I'd say Germany in particular and Scandinavia, where the publishers just didn't buy into the notion that things should be free. And it's not like they just sort of sailed through the storm, but they are healthier. But I think, and when you say 2 newspaper town, 1 newspaper, at this point, there are relatively few 1 newspaper
I know.
towns. It is such a disaster. But I also, as you hear, I can just kind of keep going on this. I have a lot of thoughts. There were people who saw it. One of the most amazing things to me going back was there was an ad exec in 2011, gave this then famous, now totally forgotten sort of Jeremiad at the annual conference of advertising executives, basically saying that we're publishing salespeople saying we cannot allow ourselves to be reduced to pork bellies, which at the time I think was sort of shrugged off and laughed off as everybody thought, wow, yeah, this traffic is so great. We have this new source of revenue and energy from the internet. And what she was saying was, well, that actually, what you've gone from selling is a page of your magazine with all this context around it to Louis Vuitton, who wants to be next to whatever's happening in Vogue, to just a blank square of internet that is utterly commoditized, and that anyone can that anyone can stick anything there, and it has no more value than it has on the dumbest, worst website in the world, even if you're Vogue. And and the thing is, it wasn't even a good commodity. It wasn't even a real commodity. Like, the publishers, the ones who really leaned into this, thought, okay, even they weren't total idiots. They thought, okay, this isn't a medium we control the way we controlled our print product. We can't do all the same stuff, but we can make more and more and more of it, and it has a certain value. And as we get more of it, that we will make more money. But the thing with a commodity is it has to be scarce, it has to be limited. And this was unlimited. And the more you made, the lower the price went. And that was really the sort of core business problem.
And it seemed, that strikes me as sort of basic economics. And what was interesting is, in reading your book, is how few people recognize that. Either that, or people that failed to recognize it, or they thought that they were going to be running institutions where they would sort of set the market, right? And that they didn't have to worry about it. But I lived through this in part in my time as editor of the Weekly Standard, where this was the problem that it seemed to me we always knew we were going to face. We had the choice to stay with sort of quality journalism, a subscription-based model, and sort of sell a premium product, or we could chase the Washington Examiner, which was our sister publication, and the bigger players like BuzzFeed and others by trying to monetize eyeballs and trying to monetize scale, and just was never going to work. So what you saw was the Weekly Standard, when it was launched and through its early years, land print advertising from places like Lockheed Martin. I think we had, fancy watches and these sort of premium products, to the point at the end, which I didn't have any control over, and this was part of my frustration there. Rampant toe fungus ads that were never, that were cheap, but we knew, or not we, but the people who were making these decisions on the business side of the house, if you could get them an extra $858.37, by God, they wanted that $858.37. And whether it came in the form of sort of bogus polls or autoplay ads or toe fungus ads, they were going to get that. They were going to get that money. And I think the incentives, the sort of circular incentives there, you needed more clicks to make those ads more valuable. Really had a long-term negative effect on the quality of the journalism.
Yeah, and they were sort of both a signal and a cause of online journalism sort of fundamentally not being economically sustainable in that moment with that model. I mean, it wasn't, honestly, like if toe fungus ads were paying for your salary and the salary of your team and, for you to do lots of good journalism, I feel like I might try to persuade you to put up with the toe fungus ads, which are not hurting anybody. And sometimes, people have very serious toe fungus issues, guys. But in fact,
you're slipping back into the rationalization. Ben Smith, toe fungus ads are good.
First, they came for the toe fungus ads.
Can you flash your foot on our video screen here, please?
I do not think you should make light of toe fungus survivors. But I mean, who among us, guys? But no, but I think, to me, like, honestly, the thing that bothers me less than how awful those ads are and how much they screw up the experience, as somebody who's been doing this for a while, is the fact that $858 won't even turn on the lights, won't pay the rent in your office, much less pay the salary of a journalist. And that and this was really, I mean, this is, I think, why you saw it happen to BuzzFeed News. Like, the business model, like, journalism is really expensive, and and if you're having reporters do original work and travel and try to find things out that people don't want them to know and publish them and occasionally get sued for it, it's expensive, and you need a revenue model that supports that. And garbage banner ads just can actually pay for someone to write something quick several times a day without doing a lot of original work, particularly if they're really, really good at it and getting attention. But it cannot pay for original reporting. And that to me is like the core problem with a lot of this.
So I was on a panel. This had to be 15 years ago. And one of the panelists, I can't remember her name, but she was a reporter for the Washington Post who also did a lot of the entry-level rookie reporter job interviews, or was one of the interviewers. And she told me how, or she said on the panel, it has been a cliche in our business forever to ask some version of this question, and the question was, you're at your desk or at your home, doesn't matter, and your window's open, and all of a sudden you hear a lot of fire engines and police cars racing down the street past your window. What do you do? And the right answer for generations was grab my notebook and pen, or grab my camera, and notebook and pen or whatever, and follow them. And she said, and I can't remember the date, but let's just say it was, maybe circa 2002 or something like that. she started getting a different answer from people. And the answer was, and these are kids like with journalism degrees or straight out of college. And the answer was, check the Drudge Report. And, these are guys who wanted to be reporters. And like, I see this not so much in our own staff because we screen really hard for this kind of thing, but there are a lot of people, and not just in straight journalism, but like in sort of media adjacent world, that think all research is done on the internet, all reporting is done on the internet, that the real world is the internet. Like, it's like they don't know that these are shadows on the walls of Plato's cave, and you actually need to like go out and, to mix metaphors, touch grass or whatever, and see the real world. And it's a real problem with like very online right wingers right now, who think that if they can dominate on Twitter, that means they're dominating in the real world. And I'm just wondering, like, I live in a fairly niche universe for both the media and ideologically, but do you see similar things in the sort of broader world of journalism? And or is that something that like is just a fad and you beat it out of your reporters in the first couple of weeks on the job and it goes away?
I think maybe I'm just not as cranky as you are, but
that's entirely possible. That's a high bar to be as cranky as I am.
It's funny because when I was, and probably when you guys were sort of starting your careers, this was actually sort of a revelation that you could go to a press conference with a politician and not ask them the sort of robotic questions everybody asked at these things, but look at what real people were talking about on the internet and ask them about that. And sort of there was this incredibly vibrant conversation first on the blogs and then on social media where, I remember reading Andrew Sullivan or Josh Marshall or one of you, and when I was covering New York back in the day, and I'd go to a press conference with a congressman, and instead of asking them about the sewer they were opening or whatever, it's a bad example, but the bridge they were opening, I'd say, hey, there's this big debate about Social Security in Washington that I've been reading about on these blogs. Like, what do you think of that? And it was a really valuable, in a way, it was just this sort of new, smart conversation that as a local news reporter who was out there on their feet all day could sort of plug into, and I think in a useful way. I do think that has now gone to this place where exactly as you say, it's a conversation largely about itself. And if you're not careful, you show up at the press conference and ask the mayoral candidate about like whether he thinks, he should have a blue check or not, or something like that.
Yeah.
But it did help. I remember an incident, and I don't remember all of the details, but there was a presidential debate at Hofstra University. It was during the McCain Obama race in 2008, and the story of the day on sort of online in this growing online world, and certainly on the right was, this allegation that Barack Obama had been, quote, palling around with terrorists, right? And this was the kind of thing that really had.
That was a story. That was a story I broke about his relationship with Bill Ayers. So this is very close to home.
Perfect. Well, you didn't pump yourself up in the book about that. But then you probably remember this in greater detail than I do. That there was a story, and the phrase was palling around with terrorists about his relationship with Bill Ayers. And the Obama team went to great lengths to distance himself from Ayers and say, I didn't really know him. This is overhyped. This isn't a big thing.
He was a guy from the neighborhood.
A guy from the neighborhood. But then, as I recall, Bill Daley, who was the chairman of the campaign, was asked about this somewhere, and in effect gave an answer that was totally off message, was something like, yeah, of course they were good friends, and who cares? And it was just like, record scratch. And I was at this debate, and they had this debate, and I was in the spin room afterwards. And as I recall, it was David Axelrod surrounded, by 50 reporters, mainstream reporters mostly. And nobody asked about this thing that I thought was a totally legitimate question. Like, was this guy friends with this bad guy who's basically a terrorist? And what about Bill Daley saying what he said? And, I tried to get the question for 5 or 10 minutes. Everybody was asking these questions about the debate and everything. And then I finally asked the question, and Axelrod, and we've laughed about this since, he sort of shot me daggers. But then the rest of the journalists in the crowd, in the gaggle, looked at me like I was nuts. And I thought, well, God, I think that's a totally legitimate question. So in some ways, this is a long way of saying, in some ways, I think you're exactly right. You could learn things that would bring sort of texture to your reporting and allow you to ask questions that didn't follow the script and didn't go along with the herd. But on the other hand, to go back to Jonah's original phrasing of the question, these right wingers who think dominating online is dominating in the real world, couldn't it be the case that in some ways actually they're right and we're wrong? That those of us who look at places like Twitter and these online conversations think, that person's too much on Twitter. This is all performative BS. That's not the real world. You've got a chapter in your book, Ben, about Benny Johnson, who worked for you at BuzzFeed, was fired for plagiarism, was let go from a second job for problems with his journalism. And within the past month, was one of the very first people to get a hangout online interview with Ron DeSantis, leading challenger to Donald Trump in the Republican nomination. Maybe Benny Johnson is winning. Maybe all these old conventions like don't plagiarize, don't make stuff up. Maybe that doesn't matter the way that we thought it would.
One thing is I think the pendulum really keeps swinging and that there's not some fixed truth to these questions. Like in 2004, the herd was the people you saw at that debate. In 2008, it was print. It was this sort of these, handful of people who were all kind of thinking the same way and doing the same stories. And you could bring the actual questions from real human beings from the internet where lots of real human beings were and inject them. And that felt really, I think, and was quite healthy. I think as social media swallowed journalism and politics and, by 2016, the herd is online and Twitter is the herd. And it's not that it doesn't have power. I think you're right. It has enormous power, but if you're looking for the conformist sort of repetitive, corrupt form of journalism, you now find that on the internet. And if you're not careful, you just become you are then part of that particular herd. I think we are now in a really weird moment of kind of change and transition between those things. And that, that social media conversation that totally dominated politics 5 years ago is in the process of kind of falling apart and flying off in pieces. But a lot of those pieces, like, say Benny Johnson, are moving with a lot of velocity and certainly matter. And I don't quite know where the whole thing comes to rest. But I do think one of the reasons I don't think it's easy to say like, well, it was, I think there is was it good then, but it's bad now, or vice versa. Like, I don't think this is a fixed, a fixed point we're looking at. What's the conservative, the tax policy approach, dynamic
scoring? Yeah, sure.
I would like to dynamically score this situation. I just think it's changed, like where moronic conventional wisdom is just keeps moving.
Well, and that's sort of as it should be, as Adam Smith would say. There's a lot of ruin in a nation, right? I mean, there it's sort of like arguments about, is pop culture decadent or terrible, right? Which is a debate that happens on the right pretty much every 15 minutes for the last 2,000 years. If the old rule in journalism is that 3 examples equals a trend, it's entirely easy to write an article saying pop culture is worse than ever. And it's also really easy to say that pop culture is better than ever, because they're in a big, complex, diverse society you're going to find virtually everything you can say about the culture is true. And so is the opposite thing. Right. Because at the same time that you're getting, I don't know, weird caterpillar crushing porn on one corner of the internet, you're getting a revival of opera on another corner of the internet. And that's just the way sort of society is. And so part of, our jobs is to discern what trends are real, what generalizations have merit, and which ones are just entirely spurious and are like sort of fan service for your readers. Because there's some readers who just want to hear about how America is going off the rails and is going to end, or how climate change is the most terrible thing ever. And you're always going to be able to find enough new, fresh anecdotes or even data to support that thesis. And it's very easy to ignore all the contrary data. And I think that that's sort of that's the dynamic that is screwing up so much of, I hate the phrase our democracy and all this democracy talk, but it is really deleterious to democracy where everybody is out there trying to prove their own thesis for their own small, sticky part of the readership, the listenership, the voting public. And so you get people hooked on really wildly divergent narratives. And I think the old Walter Cronkite era had a lot of flaws, a lot of flaws. But there was something fundamentally useful and good for society when you had at least one generally dominant narrative about the country, whether it was good or bad, that got people to buy into. And I find that the balkanization that social media and the digital revolution creates really does let people live in such wildly divergent worlds that they can't even talk to each other. And I don't know how you get out of that.
I mean, I'm not sure there is a simple path out. I mean, it is, it's interesting. People talk about people living in their own bubbles. And of course, social media really isn't a bubble. Like in social media, people are often being presented often with the worst version of their enemies and their people they disagree with. But it is an open space where people are yelling at each other who disagree, not a closed, consensus place. And I think some of us thought, and sometimes personally experienced, having good faith arguments where you change your mind on social media. And like that was sort of the promise and what was so lovely actually about early Twitter. And which is sort of, people working, arguing in a way that was aimed at finding spaces of agreement or things you could agree on. And that is, obviously turns out that is not how social media works. And I guess I sort of think that paradoxically that like we're now in this moment when people are moving off of those platforms toward more closed spaces like podcasts, actually, certainly one, newsletters, like, sort of one-to-one relationships with publishers or individuals they trust, not this sort of, and maybe that's a world in which sort of paradoxically there's a little more space for good faith disagreement. I mean, I think that one of the, and this is sort of in the book, but one of the things it's hard to remember and sort of put your head back into is that as these big platforms, Facebook and Twitter, rose, we all had theories about what would happen there. But BuzzFeed, sort of one of the big operating assumptions was that where people might be their kind of like worst and most depraved selves in like the privacy of the Google search bar, they would be their best selves in the public social media spaces. You'd want to present yourself as someone who cared about earthquake victims.
Oh, bless your hearts.
Exactly. And I just remember, and BuzzFeed's early slogan was "No haters." And that was like because Jonah really had made a bet that the kind of content that would be most shared in these public spaces was content that basically made the person sharing it look good to their friends. And obviously nobody would want to be the insane person screaming about super divisive politics in a public space all the time. Like nobody likes that guy. Why would you be that person in public? And this was it's sort of hard to imagine that this was a thing we thought and did not sound totally delusional. But this was a prediction about social media that obviously did not bear out.
I mean, I don't think it was a crazy sort of way of thinking about the rise of these new technologies. It just seems that the blind spot was the single asshole sitting in his basement who discovers that, oh, wow, a lot of other people are racist too. And I can share my racist stuff online and get all sorts of affirmation and learn that there's a much bigger group here than I thought there was. That seems to be what part of what drove some of these changes. Let me ask you a question related to that. Another one of the big things that sort of I took away from reading the book wasn't necessarily a view that I had about what you wrote, but I put in my place as the reader, someone on the right who has been sort of pounding mainstream media and all of these platforms, big tech, for being progressive and left leaning. And while I certainly think that's true, and I've made those arguments for years, one of the things that struck me in the book is you actually, in many ways, sort of give fodder to those arguments. I mean, it's like everybody was literally going to the same parties in Manhattan. They all knew each other. They were all talking with the people who were building places like Huffington Post and BuzzFeed and Gawker and Jezebel and others were all talking to the same people. Many of them had relationships with leaders of Facebook and these tech companies, and they, in some cases, like actively plotted how to help Democratic campaigns win. I mean, this was a main motivation for Kenny Lehrer, who's a main character in the book. Is it the case that if somebody from the right who brings a deep skepticism of sort of mainstream media and its biases before this, but then also the rise of this digital native media, comes away thinking, I was even more right than I thought?
Well, you sort of have to go back to that moment. And this was not exactly a secret. Huffington Post was to Obama what Breitbart was to Trump in some sense. They were totally aligned with him. And more sort of obviously, but again, you sort of have to remember, like, the moment. I mean, Facebook was where college kids went. So, like, if you're going to do politics in that space, if you're trying to get Facebook users to vote, you're obviously a Democrat, right? Like, it's like MTV Rock the Vote was not a partisan effort, but who was watching MTV in the 80s? Kids. So they're Democrats. And when, in 2011, Barack Obama visited Facebook, and he didn't have to say, thank you for forming part of my base and turning out votes. But that's who was on those platforms. Like, it's obvious. It was young people, and young people lean Democratic. And so I think it wasn't the internet, and these parts of the internet in particular were mostly populated by young people. And so there was just a largely unspoken presumption, and not everywhere, right? The Drudge Report was a conservative, whatever, page and powerhouse. And there were certainly all sorts of parts of the internet that were conservative, but the liberal parts were bigger because that's who was on the internet. And what changed was everybody, all of society by 2016 is on the internet and on Facebook. And these sort of smug assumptions, I think, from people on the left that, like, oh yeah, like this new digital technological shift just intrinsically favors Democrats and progressives and the future belongs to us. They sort of, is totally wrong. But if you go back to how people are thinking, in the early 2000s, it seems totally obvious that the election of Barack Obama is the pinnacle and sort of apogee of this movement in this moment. And then you wait a few years and you realize, oh no, actually the election of Donald Trump is the real culmination of all of this. And that's for a number of reasons. And I don't think, some technical trick of Facebook is the main reason people like Donald Trump. But there's something about that kind of right-wing populism, which is about kind of transgression and is very, very angry and isn't overly concerned with facts and which exists, to sort of challenge and tear down institutions, that is incredibly well suited for social media in general and for the world that the technical sort of the technical way in which Facebook happens to be working in 2015, 2016 in particular.
So I think that's actually a really good answer in a lot of different ways. Because you're right, there was just sort of synergy between these various social forces. At the same time, less about the history of the internet. To pick up on Steve's question, your former media critic, media reporter for the New York Post, New York Times. I generally try not to do the liberal media bias thing, not because I don't think it exists, but because there's nothing new to say about it, really. I think it's just an irrefutable, undeniable fact. And then the only thing that's worth debating is how big a problem it is, whether some specific incident is a manifestation of it or not. But I just think it's real. And so, like, even before the internet, I remember the early days of the internet, a good friend of mine who I will not name, but both of you guys know him, was very prominent conservative, was dating a former Clinton official, prominent Democrat. And he was like, look, I've spent my entire adult life in the media, in conservative circles, and never met, more than a handful outside of a green room, never met more than a handful of sort of Democratic Party activists or New York Times reporters in a social setting. But all of a sudden I'm dating a Democrat, and every party that they went to that she was invited to was 3 New York Times reporters, 2 of which were dating 2 prominent Democratic, party officials. The incestuousness that of just, when I say incestuousness, I'm not saying it's sinister or evil, but the sociological overlap, the social overlap between your typical ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post reporter, writer, editor, and the Democratic Party is just much greater than anything that you see on the right. I mean, just sort of sociologically, every now and then someone says, I think I know a guy at NBC who might be a secret one of us, right? But there's not like this just sort of semi-permeable barrier where people go back and forth. I mean, the rules about going from politics to journalism and journalism to politics have been utterly shattered in the last 25 years, so that nobody even really looks askance at them. But there's a reason why Democratic administrations knew to go to Linda Douglas and Jay Carney and all of these guys, because they'd seen them at parties. Maybe some of their people were married to them or whatever. They knew who they were. They knew they were liberals. They knew they weren't, and they could tell they weren't hiding it particularly well in their reporting. And I think that there's something that a lot of mainstream journalists, who I think still do a good job, even though I think they have liberal biases, do not appreciate in where the criticism of liberal media bias comes from. Because there are a lot of conservatives who just feel like you guys are trying to pull a fast one on me. You're trying to gaslight me. You're denying something that's obvious. And it drove a lot of people crazy. And I think that was a big one. I mean, the encyclopedia of how we got Trump has many volumes, but one of the volumes is precisely on this frustration with the mainstream media that never wanted to acknowledge something that basically was an article of faith, and rightly so, for almost every single conservative. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you think about the whole topic, particularly just on the sort of the social level of the how friends from college, one goes to the Democratic Party, one goes to the New York Times, and they never lose touch because they're seeing each other and talking to each other all the time because those worlds overlap so much.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with some and disagree with parts of what you said. And I think it's in a way like it's not totally unlike what I said about the internet before. Like, what's the college educated people who live in big cities tend to be Democrats and tend to have a set of views that aren't, I don't think, like broadly identical to all Democrats. Like, I don't think they tend to be, if they're a higher income, they like taxes less, and and they have like, I mean, it's a specific demographic slice of people who are mostly working in journalism, and you get a lot of variance within that. But yes, but you're certainly finding more people who are going to vote for a Democratic president. But I don't think and part of what's so challenging is there's not a symmetrical conservative media that is doing original reporting. And as Tucker Carlson once gave a great speech calling for this and sort of challenging these sort of big journalistic institutions on their own terrain of doing original reporting. What you have is these big institutions doing the original reporting, and which is often uncontroversial, which is often, here's what happened yesterday. And then much of what is sort of, the conservative media, but particularly say Fox News, is commentary on those facts. And so, as you know, it's just like, it's not it's a complicated picture.
I mean, you were leading up to the reason we launched the Dispatch speech there, but go on, because we're with you on that diagnosis.
Yeah. So right, but I think, I mean, and I guess I do think, and this is, I'll plug my own publication, Semaphore, here. I mean, I think that that's something that that could change. Like, to me, like, one of the things about ChatGPT that's interesting is that maybe it opens space for journalists who don't have college degrees and aren't trained writers to be more, to produce really well written stuff that is then part of this, the media space. Because I do think one of the things that happened to journalism over the last 40 years was it went from being a trade that was practiced all over the country, and mostly still by people who leaned left and sympathized with the oppressed in Indianapolis or in Memphis or wherever. Because I do think there are elements of like what draws you to do that particular kind of job that, in some sense, you often do find people who are more sympathetic to the workers than the bosses. But that said, it to a profession that's practiced mostly by college educated people in the cities. And I think that's not an inevitable truth, but it is the truth now. But the other thing, given that, is that I do think there's like a moment when readers, viewers want to know who they're hearing from, like not just in a sense of like which publication, but want to feel like they're speaking to individuals who they know where they're coming from and whose opinions are to some degree on their sleeve. Who aren't hiding the ball in any way. And it's easier to, like, I'd rather know where you're coming from and know where I disagree with you than have you feel like professionally that your job is to hide the ball of who you are and where you're coming from. And I think that creates a kind of uncanny valley and a lack of trust. And I don't think conservatives are going to like love a media that is more honest about what its participants think necessarily, but there's something a bit more honest about it, I guess.
Well, and we're certainly doing some of that. Obviously, Semafor is doing that sort of in a slightly different way. We kind of announced institutionally, hey, we generally come from the center right, and you should understand as consumers of our information that the reporting and analyses that we do will be informed by views broadly on the center right. But then we just go out and report the stuff, and we tell people what we find, and we share with them the truth based on our understanding of the truth, based on our questions. You all do it a little differently, where you have reporters who go out and report sort of what they see as the facts, and then offer their view, and then offer a counter view. What can you tell us, just conceptually, as you thought about how to build Semafor from an editorial perspective? I heard somebody not long ago describe it as sort of solving for the trust problem by design, by product.
Wow, that should be our slogan.
Product design. Is that what you're doing? How should we understand what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things we're doing. Certainly, first of all, like, you can, when you're hiring journalists, try to hire people who are basically fair and who come from a variety of backgrounds. And we certainly did that. And I think if you look at the folks we've hired, they do come from different places personally and politically, So, Shelby, the great reporter, Shelby Talcott, you should follow, came from the Daily Caller. And before that was a professional tennis player. And I think I think it is that genuinely valuable to have people who have different life experiences and aren't sort of coming from the Medill Journalism School at Northwestern or wherever people get journalists these days. I think the way we've tried to translate that ethos into the work is to have our stories, designed and built in a way that sort of pushes reporters to say, here are the facts of the story and here's my opinion. And I think, the kind of people I'm hiring, and I guess I'll speak for myself, my opinion tends to be analytical rather than, and I'm going to vote for so-and-so. But I think the thing that is often, I think, left out of reporting is that, like, a lot of reporters, good reporters, are experts in what they cover. Liz Hoffman, who's covering Wall Street for us, was the best Wall Street reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And so if she's breaking a story about, as we broke the story about Microsoft acquiring ChatGPT with she and a colleague, Reed Albergati, and they have thoughts on what that means. And the typical sort of newspaper move is to say, you should go find an expert to quote to convey their thoughts. But actually, if you're a reporter who's been covering this for 10 years, you might know more than that expert. And so you're going to choose an expert who says the thing that you want to say. And so I think our model is to say, no, like these reporters mostly know what they're talking about. When they do, they're going to tell you what they think. And if they have some sort of provocative analysis of it or take on it, they have to recognize that could be wrong. Because if you have some theory, if it's interesting, there's a possibility it's going to be wrong, and some smart person may have a dissenting view. And we want to sort of bend over backward to say, here are the facts which are indisputable. Here's my take, and here's somebody who disagrees with me. And then we found that the readers like that.
Do you worry that advances this kind of binary framing that sometimes obscures the truth rather than illuminates it? We have this view, somebody has the opposite view. That's sort of the universe of views.
Yeah, no. I mean, we try to bring in, more than two views, and often, and I think, when you're writing specific stories about complicated things, the views aren't usually A, this is bad, B, this is good, right? It's different interpretations of a set of facts, of which there can be many. But I don't think like the sort of crossfire false balance model is something anybody in particular wants. But that said, I think that, and it's something I do, and it drives me crazy. You read an article in a publication you like, and you think, this is probably right, but I'm going to go Google the subject of the article and read 4 or 5 more articles and triangulate what is going on. And that is like a depraved way to consume media, obviously. And so we do. So in some sense, we're trying to, to like solve for that and say to the reader, like, we know that you don't, that we know that you're going to do that. And so we're going to try to do it for you and bring in these different perspectives and let you see them.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I wish more readers did that. Whenever, I'm sure you get this question, I know Steve gets this question, people ask, what should I read? What should I read that I can trust, right? You get that kind of question whenever you do a speaking event, or at least I do. And
I hope you play Semaphore.
Well, I'll list a few places. Semaphore would be one of them. But the point I always try to make is have a diverse media diet, right? I mean, obviously, if you're going to do one-stop shopping, we would like you to do it at the Dispatch. And then if not the Dispatch, go to Semaphore. That's great. I feel like Santa's sending customers to Gimbals, as the Macy's Santa and Miracle on 34th Street here. But the important thing is to have a diverse media diet, right? And I think that part of this is sort of, we've talking around this for a bit, but like part of the problem with most news consumers is that they basically binge on one snack food. And sometimes they binge on good ones. Like if all you're ever reading is The Economist, you're going to be okay. Like you might have certain highfalutin misunderstandings about some very high-end technical things, but you'll be fine. But if all you're doing is watching Fox News or MSNBC all day, you will get radically different understandings of what the universe is. In fact, if all you're doing is getting your news from the New York Times, you'll get a lot of good coverage of a lot of stuff. But on certain high frequency cultural issues, you will get a really bad misreading of the national mood, the national understanding of certain issues. Your understanding of trans issues will basically be that there are people like me who believe in maximal freedom and giving minors gender affirming care at whatever age they want it. And then there are all these bigoted people in the rest of the country. And you'll get a very similar sort of read from the Washington Post and that kind of thing. The only way to like level set and acid test your assumptions about the world is to get competing points of view. And I think there's just precious few people who do that. So I read the New York Times. I think it's a great newspaper, but I think I disagree with some of its narratives.
And I think social media was sort of supposed to do that. And at its best, social media was amazing for that. But actually, what social media is best at now is giving you a straw man caricature of what your enemies think, sort of what you just gave, honestly, on the trans stuff, I would say. And I think this is really something we think about a lot, is trying to like find the smart, thoughtful version of the thing that is not exactly aligned with the other thing you read. And because I think there is a lot, I don't know. I mean, I certainly want that as a reader, and I do think there's a lot of appetite for it.
I should say you're right about the New York Times and the trans thing. I more like the Washington Post and the trans stuff. The Times has actually kind of been more balanced on it. You're right.
Right. No, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to criticize you particularly. I just think what social media does, like it was supposed to, and its best, you were saying, wow, like I'm seeing the British and French articles about the Iraq war, and they sure are different from what the New York Times is saying. That's sort of, on a different moment. And that's sort of, and that's an incredibly valuable thing to have. And now it's like I am seeing the absolute most insane version of whatever of an argument that I already was inclined to dislike, that's been screenshotted from some random person and presented to me 1,000 times over and over again, because that's just sort of how that system functions best.
So Steve, did you want to jump in on that, or you look pained?
No, I'm good. I mean, I could go in like 80 different directions, but we've been going for a while, so I assume you're ready to wrap.
So just before we started rolling tape, I made a joke at Steve's expense where he was saying he was saying to Ben, I hear you like on all the podcasts I listen to. And I was like, dude, that's a sign that you need to diversify your podcast consumption. And I didn't mean it as an insult to you, Ben. I just meant it as an assault to Steve. But my explanation for it is that Steve listens to a lot of industry stuff about the media, right? He's gets really granular on the media stuff and all that. And I was saying how I'm kind of getting exhausted by media conversations. I spent 20 years, 30 years criticizing liberal media bias. I barely talk about it anymore, precisely because during the Trump years, you hear criticism of Donald Trump, and then his sort of Praetorian Guard would say, yeah, but what about the New York Times? And I was like, oh, the New York Times is an inanimate object that is not president of the United States, but it's taken on this sort of talismanic kind of role on the right that gives permission to the right to justify all sorts of garbage. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is the journalism industry is tiny, right? I mean, I was looking on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's like less than 50,000 people are in journalism at this point. I mean, I haven't looked at the fine print about how they define in journalism, but say it's triple that, fine, whatever. There are probably more people in coal mining. There are probably more people in, there are probably 10 times, 20 times, 30 times as many people in plumbing and refrigeration and these kinds of things. And yet there is this obsession of people in the media to write about the media. I get it. For some people, it's their job and they should, but like, is the constant talk about the role of the media, what the media does, how heroic the media is. And I'm not talking about war correspondents in Ukraine. I'm just talking about everyday sort of, reporters. Is the constant conversation about ourselves one of the reasons why the media is in such low regard out there? I mean, is it a problem?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I am also driven crazy by the kind of, I don't think it's helpful for journalists to present themselves as a sort of heroic, fighting priesthood. And I was at some of these, it's one of my least favorite things about Washington. I was at the White House Correspondents, weekend recently. And, for a long time you would go to these parties and people would give speeches about how you were, drinking champagne and eating canapes for the troops. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that now we're also drinking champagne for the heroic journalists who put their lives on the line every day by going to the White House and writing down what the president said. And I do find that really counterproductive, and not helpful and not in line with, there are in fact heroic journalists who are putting their lives on the line in combat zones, but that's not most of the folks who are there. And it's not really, and there is, I do think the Trump era created this democracy dies in the dark vibe that sort of made, how dare you question what I'm doing professionally and my work, because it's, I am the last guardian of democracy. And I understand the impulse. There is actually some truth to that. The free press is an important part of democracy. But I don't know. I was last night, I was with a journalist who had been on the receiving end of one of these speeches, and he was like, "Honestly, I'm a gossip columnist. It felt a little weird." And I just don't think it. I think it gives it's in a moment when people really want transparency and honesty. It's not that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think yes, but I think also there's a way in which politics was always the media business too, and has become increasingly entwined with it. And President Trump in particular, a lot of his approach was to pick fights with the press to get attention, and it's really Benji Sarlin had a great piece recently about how Trump attacked the press all the time. And DeSantis took him literally rather than seriously, and was like, "Wow, Donald Trump told us that we should hate the press, and so I'm going to live in a cave and never speak to journalists because I have learned from the dear leader." But of course, for Trump it was a game, and he talked to the press constantly, and that friction he generated with the press was a way to get attention, whether you like it or not, and to sweep what might have been kind of objective observers of his into a conflict with him where there was he was going to be the only winner. And I think Republican politicians who look at him and say, "Oh, this man dislikes the media and does not want to interact with the media, and I will take that lesson," are obviously misreading what he was doing.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that. I mean, I think for better and for worse, and in almost every single situation worse, the changes in our information environment have driven the changes in our politics. And, in that sense, people were right to be paying attention to the media and to want to know more about the media. I mean, I look back and I think that it's entirely justifiable that so many conservatives looked at the mainstream media for years and said, they don't represent me. They don't talk about things the way that I talk about things. And as often as not, they deride people who believe the things that I believe. So I'm not going there for my information. And then unfortunately, you see the rise of this alternative media ecosystem for entirely understandable reasons. And at the beginning of it, I was optimistic about it. That's turned into, these pick your descriptor, silo or echo chamber, whatever. And people who are looking for affirmation can go to those places for that affirmation. And what was so interesting about the book in many different ways is you sort of give us step by step how that happened broadly, not particularly on the right, although your time that you spend reporting and describing the Breitbart phenomenon and Benny Johnson gives us sort of a window into that, but just the whole way in which these media outlets and the attention economy was driving this. I mean, at one point early in the Obama run, you describe stories that made Obama look good in 2007, 2008 as the side boob of politics. And Jonah probably won't understand that. But for the listeners who do understand that, it had tremendous appeal. And that's what drove people to consume this kind of information. And I think it's distorted the way that we do our politics. And the book was, I think, just a really helpful. I mean, I lived this, as Jonah said. I've become sort of obsessed with it, and I learned a ton from the reporting in the book. So very helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is. Yeah, I mean, the media and politics have become totally intertwined in a way that is, perhaps not the healthiest thing in the world, but hard to untangle.
Yeah, I you know what I do? I blame George Magazine. George and Talk Magazine, which nobody remembers now, but there was this moment at the end of history in the 1990s where, the sort of what was the Paul Begala line that
politics is Hollywood for ugly people. Yeah, right. Politics became glamorous. It does make you pine for the old days of sort of faceless uncharismatic machine bosses and of machine politics. And actually, it is. I do think. I mean, people have a lot of criticism of the way urban politics in America work these days. And I haven't been particularly blown away by recent mayors of New York, but there is something about the kind of uncharismatic, sort of non-ideological machine hacks who mostly run American cities that lacks the totally like delusional quality of national politics.
Yeah. There's also something to be said for the old style, and I use this word not as pejoratively as it sounds to some people, but the old-fashioned journalistic hacks, right? Like the Fleet Street guys who show up, they listen to what some dude is saying, they maybe show up drunk, but they write it down, right? You know, I mean, like the journalistic profession used to be closer to a blue collar profession than it is today, and I think that's
and more modest about its own power. So like, if only we wrote it down differently, the world would be different. I do think we sort of sometimes overestimate our own role in this whole system.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I blame the sort of talk George era was that that was when the blood-brain barrier between Hollywood and politics really broke. You know, and like so much so, people forget there's a big controversy that what was it? Like the movie Contact, Forrest Gump was the big one, right? Where you basically started seeing news anchors play themselves in movies. And like cable news footage was used to advance the plot of movies. And that whole era sort of sociologically was people sort of telling on themselves that they saw the news as sort of storycraft, right? In a way that I don't think would have been tolerated in 10, 20 years earlier. And I think we're sort of downstream of that. Trump is one of these guys. I mean, Trump is the guy who like most completely jumped the blood-brain barrier. People say, well, what about Reagan? But like Reagan, like he started over as a politician and became a governor of a state and, did all sorts of things, after he was an actor. It wasn't like he just parachuted into the White House. Trump just jumped out of a reality show into the White House. And I think that aspect of the 1990s of being sort of meta-narrative, mushing together politics and journalism and policy, the West Wing world is more to blame for a lot of our problems today than people want to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think so much blame to go around.
Yes, that's right. And I should be empowered to give it out.
That's why you have a podcast.
Ben Smith, so thank you so much for doing this. Everyone should get the book. We will put links to the great booksellers in the show notes. The book is Traffic. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was fun, guys.
All right, so Ben Smith has left the studio, but like a bar at closing time, Steve Hayes is still hanging around.
but you're stuck with me. What'd
you make of all that? What'd you make of the book in general?
It's super interesting. I thought the book was fascinating. What strikes me as we just wrap up the interview is that he's got a chapter, and probably the thing that most of our listeners, your listeners, know Ben Smith for is the dossier. And we didn't even get to any questions about the dossier. Yeah. I have like a list of 6 more pages worth of questions. No, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, he's very thoughtful about sort of journalism, and the book is not. I would not call it a mea culpa, but he's very honest about the areas where he had blind spots or where he contributed to the problems that I think Semafor is trying to solve now, and he does it in a way that doesn't come across as overly preachy or putting himself on the couch. It's just very readable and smart in my view. What do you think?
Oh, I think I felt bad. I thought I was a little harsh on him with the whole "don't listen to podcasts that he's on" thing. No, I think it's interesting. I think it's one of these. Again, I've only barely, I just started the book, but I have such specific, probably misleading, distorting experiences in this space, right? So like, I was, running National Review Online, back in the day. And then I was taking credit for running National Review Online for years afterwards. So I had to pretend that I was more, and I still had the title of editor of National Review Online for a long time. And, even though basically Catherine Lopez was doing all the hard work and I was, just sort of kibitzing. As I was sort of alluding to before, there are all of these moments in this stuff where I was like, this is a stupid way for people to go. And it seemed kind of obvious to me. And sometimes I was wrong, but I don't know. I just have I have very strong personal experiences with all of this stuff, worrying about this stuff. I think it's very interesting how nostalgic he seems to be for the golden age of blogging, which I am too. So I don't know. I really haven't made up my mind. I mean, I don't think he's a villain in the story. I mean, obviously, but for lots of us, I think he's basically right. Is that the sort of digital revolution, the social media revolution, these were just giant waves. And the idea that individual, captains of ships or navigators of ships could do much by way of not being pushed by those waves is kind of fanciful. There's just not a lot of room for human agency when you're talking about this kind of upheaval.
But it is interesting to me at the same time. I mean, and maybe you're right, and maybe this is the explanation that I'm seeking. But as he's describing the rise of BuzzFeed, and he's describing the rise of the Huffington Post and the rise of Gawker, all of them are driven by attention, right? Traffic. I mean, that's the title of the book. And you really don't see, in a way that rung true to me, having lived through the period, nobody sort of pauses and says like, hey, is this good for journalism? Is this good for the country? Is this, is this helpful? And in ways that I suppose if you're caught up in the moment, or if your view is that there's nothing you can do to sort of redirect this to more positive ends, maybe the right play was just to try to game it. I mean, the gamification of traffic and attention with those players, and then many others beyond them, was fascinating to read about from sort of an inside perspective.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? This is the Life Safety Director speaking. I repeat, this is the internal for hotel employees.
His title is Life Saving Director? Is that his title?
I think Life Safety.
I'm getting that on my cards. I quit as CEO.
So I apologize. That was a real moment for listeners. I don't know if we'll actually end up in the final product, but I'm in the Grand Hyatt Hotel in New York, and apparently they're running a drill for either the Life Safety Director or the Life Saving Director. Either one. It's a little nervous making that. It's like, for a long time, it used to freak out my mom. The phone company, AT&T. Jesus.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? This is the Life Safety Director speaking.
I think it's life saving.
May I have your attention?
Jesus.
May I have your attention, please?
Sorry for the blasphemy.
It's going to happen again the second you talk.
It's almost as if the modern hotel industry has no respect for the podcasting industry. Oh no, I was just going to say like that. AT&T used to, the customer service people, they would close with "Have a safe day." It's like, that's kind of creepy. Like, what do they know about my day? All right. Anyway, we should just call it quits here. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for helping out.
Yeah, it was fun.
And now I got to drive back. By the way, so like I mentioned this at the top of the show. Again, Adam, you can cut this out if this is useless. But I'm in the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is like next to Grand Central. It's like it's the whole point of existence. I'm on the 19th floor. Grand Central Station is still taller than my window. I did not realize that Grand Central was like over 20 stories tall. The Grand Terminal thing, the ceiling height is really awesome and stuff, but I didn't think it was like 20 stories above me. Anyway, kind of interesting. So with that, I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.